up for the benefit of the people on Zoom. My name is Robert Bunkin, and I'm an artist, but I have taught art history for over 25 years in museums and in universities. And I give these talks once a month at Hudson Park Library. I call the program Art Talk. If we want to be very informal, we call it Art Talk with Robert. That's me. I say that I'm impersonating an art historian because really these talks are generated from my personal interest. There's no particular rhyme or reason in terms of the programming why a particular topic is being offered. It's purely based on my own enthusiasm and my own interest. And tonight I'm going to be talking about Ife heads in brass and terracotta. These are largely just representations of heads, although you will also see some heads on bodies. But the photograph that you're seeing now, which I hope everybody's seeing on Zoom, is a historic photograph taken in 1938 showing the heads that were found in a place in Nigeria called Wumonije Compound. And if anybody from Nigeria is listening to this, I apologize because I have no idea what Yoruba pronunciation is. But the Ife are a group that are part of the Yoruba people, and they live, the group of people I'm focusing on occupy a city called Ile-Ife in Nigeria. And they produced these magnificent portrait heads that have been a source of controversy, but also a way of kind of rethinking about African art in general. So when this photograph was seen in Europe for the first time in the 1930s, and people became acquainted with this work, it really changed their whole idea of what African art could be like, because most Europeans thought of African art as the sort of thing that people like Picasso and Matisse and Duran and early modernist painters were collecting and were inspired by, which was much more geometric, much more stylized, not the naturalistic images that you see in these heads. And the reason why that was a surprise was because nobody really knew that African artists produced these realistic portraits until this body of work was revealed. The first European to start to look at this work was a German named Leo Frobenius. He spent a part of 1910 in Nigeria, and he brought back to Europe with him, to Germany, some works that he found, and he published a kind of portfolio that revealed some of this work. But he did not believe that the people who made these sculptures could have been native Africans. So he made a thesis that was totally kind of off the wall, and of course is no longer believed, which there was a colony of Greeks from the lost continent of Atlantis who came to Africa and made these works of art, because it seemed to him that they were much closer. Although they clearly represented Africans, the technique to Frobenius looked like bronze casting that the Greeks had mastered.
What is it made of?
Bronze, brass, but I'm going to get to that. Okay, so first I wanted to establish the geography that we're talking about. So the red inset on this map of the continent of Africa shows you the modern country of Nigeria. Now you have to bear in mind that Africa really, its modern nation states, those boundaries were really established under colonialism. So they had nothing to do with the various peoples and nations that existed before the European colonization of, with some exceptions, but for the most part, this really reflects the colonial divisions of Africa. And the inset shows you a brown area in the map of Nigeria where the Yoruba are concentrated. So that's the map of Nigeria with various ethnic groups, and the area where the Yoruba people, sometimes referred to as Yoruba land. And within that, you'll see the city of Ife, which is really what we're going to be focusing on tonight. And this is another map of Nigeria, but it represents an archaeological map of an even earlier culture that's come to be known as Nok. It's named after a town called Nok. And this predates the Ife art that I'm going to focus on by about 1,000 years. So there's a kind of a gap between the Nok and the Ife. And if you look at the bottom of the map, you'll see the Ife area. So it's quite far from the Nok. But the reason I'm showing you this is because this is believed to be archaeologically like the predecessor of the Ife culture. And they were primarily known for these really beautiful terracotta heads and figures. Most of the heads are probably fragments from what were entire figures. So I have one example of a Nok head, which is probably a fragment, and then an intact figure. So it's fairly easy to recognize Nok sculpture because there are certain stylizations in their sculpture that always reoccur. For example, the way the eyes are fashioned, they're always sort of like sideways D shapes with a hole, because these are hollow. These are clay, terracotta, fired clay sculptures, and they're always based on cylinders. And that makes a lot of sense because of the way they're fashioned, because when you think about pottery, they're basically cylindrical, and their pottery would not have been done on a wheel. It was done by the coil method, which probably everybody's familiar with, because like every kid has a chance to make a coil pot in school, usually. So literally you sort of roll out pieces of clay, and you connect them to a circle, and then you build on that, and then you can smooth the walls to get rid of all the seams, and you get a cylinder that way. So both of these, the head and the figure, would have been fashioned using a coil method. And you can recognize other things, like the lips are similar in the way they're rendered, although one has closed lips and the head has open lips. They're always hollow because they would be fired, and you would never leave a fairly large clay object solid because it would probably explode in the kiln. So they're always hollow. So they're always to some degree like a vessel, although I'm not claiming that they were used as vessels. So this style flourished from roughly about 700 BC to about 200 AD. And then there's a gap between the Ife, which is what I'm going to be focusing on, and this work. Now, we also know that Nok worked in iron. So they had a pretty sophisticated technology, ironwork and terracotta. So this is the first Ife work that I'm showing. And you actually saw this in the black and white photograph. This was the object that was in the foreground, lying on its side. So this is made out of pure copper, or pretty close to pure copper. It's not an alloy. A lot of the Ife objects were referred to as bronzes, but actually analysis of the metal shows that the alloy was closer to brass. So I'm referring to them as brass. But some of them were made out of almost pure copper. So this is a mask, and that's fairly unique because most of the other Ife objects, which you're going to see that were cast in brass or copper, are three-dimensional. This, if you notice, from the side, it suddenly stops. It doesn't have the back of the cranium because it could have been worn as a mask. And I say could have because also it has eye slits. So just below the eyes, you see these slits. And I brought with me a wooden Yoruba mask that I happen to own, which has similar eye slits, so I can show it to you.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So that's a Yoruba. It's not Ife, it's Yoruba, but and it's made of wood, not of brass. And you can come and look at it better. But so this is an Ife, a Yoruba mask, which is probably influenced by Ife sculpture. I don't know what part of Yoruba land this actually came from, but it's not a highly valuable, it's not a ceremonial mask, but I really like it. So anyway, so but it's good to see that in relation to this.
When you put it on, can you see?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, I see you. But it's not comfortable because it hasn't been hollowed enough deeply to accommodate my nose. So my nose is sort of smashed into it. And because it doesn't have any oil stains in it, it shows that it was never actually used. Because ceremonial masks that were actually danced in ceremonies would have stains and also would probably be crafted better to be more comfortable to wear it. So it can be worn, but I don't think it was ever meant to be worn. This, on the other hand, we don't know. And there's a few reasons why it's a bit of a question. One thing is, being that it's made of copper, it's fairly heavy. So it would not be very comfortable for someone to wear it. However, that said, there are ceremonial masks that are worn in different African groups that are even heavier than this. So, I mean, I know that there are masks, like, for example, the Dogon wear masks with very, very tall components that would be very heavy. Those dancers are very strong and they're trained to wear these particular masks in certain ceremonials. So they would have the neck strength and the body strength to, so it's possible that this could have been worn. And I've never read any examination of the inside of it to show any indication of whether, like, there would be sweat stains or anything that would, you know, corrode the metal that would indicate that it was actually worn. Yeah, you have a question?
Are there any other holes in that, like, is the mouth open?
I think this does have a slit in the mouth. I don't know about the nostrils, but I think the mouth is open too. Yeah, I think that. So it is possible to breathe through it and see through it. But again, we don't know. The other thing that's interesting about it is it does have a series of holes on the side, which could have been used to tie it or to hold it in place to a larger costume. So that's another. Yeah, well, it's going to be hot under that mask no matter what you do. But there's one other thing that's really interesting about this mask, which is, well, there's a few things. It also has holes around the mouth and below the mouth. And what does that sort of, what do you think that might suggest?
Carbon dioxide.
Well, yeah, but more practically in terms of masquerade, like what might that suggest? The holes around, you know, just around below the nose, around the mouth, and below that. Facial hair, right? And maybe also if you look at the hairline, it's got holes around the hairline. So it could be that originally hair or something imitating hair was attached to this. And that's not at all uncommon. In many cultures, you see material that's added that wouldn't survive because it's organic. So
in a way, it looks like a woman.
It looks like a woman? Okay, well, the Ife think that the people that made this believe that this represents an Oni, which is the name of the king, the Oni of Ife, Abalufon II, who was a historic king and is credited with introducing brass casting to Ife. So this would be the king who really not so much developed the technique himself, because he wasn't a metallurgist, but he would have commissioned people, craftsmen, to make these. So the Ife believed that that's who this represents, and he would have been a man. The Oni is always male. It's a patriarchal culture, just like a lot of cultures. And I should mention, just it says here, the work was kept in the Oni's palace and was not recovered archaeologically. So this was part of the cache of works that were recovered from Wumonije Compound in 1938. And it was in that photograph that I showed you. I'll just go back for a moment to show it to you again. So it's the, I'll show it with the cursor. This figure here, okay, right in the corner. And there's the mask that we just looked at. Okay, so this sculpture was uncovered and was brought by William Fagg, who was the archaeologist who found this, British archaeologist. He and his brother, Bernard Fagg and William Fagg, F-A-G-G, both worked extensively in Nigeria. And I think Bernard, his brother, worked a lot with Nok material, and he rediscovered a lot of the Nok stuff and wrote about it. And then his brother, William, uncovered this and other works and wrote extensively about it. And by the time they came up with this cache in 1938, Frobenius's work had been largely forgotten, and they sort of revived the interest in that. And they started to suspect that, in fact, all of this artwork was made by indigenous Africans and not by some wacko group of Greeks who arrived from the lost continent of Atlantis to Africa to make these things, which very much reflects the prevalent European ideas, you know, during colonization, that Africans were not able to do things like this. Principally also because, for two reasons, the naturalism of the heads and the sophisticated casting technique that they use, because these are very, very, very sensitive, very highly skilled casting in brass, which I'm going to get into of course they're gorgeous. That's why I want you to see it. Yeah, so he's wearing this tiered crown, which has a crest, a circular crest in the middle, and then this little kind of doohickey that looks like a braid sticking up from the top. And he also, there's like flaps coming out from behind his ears. If you look at the back of it, which I don't have a picture of it from the back, but it has a kind of a flap that comes down from the crown. And you'll see that again in some of the other images. So this sculpture is exceptional in that it's now in the British Museum in London, along with two other Ife heads. And this gentleman is the current Oni of Ife. He is the current king of the Ife people, Oba Adeyeye Enitan Ogunwusi. He's a fairly young guy in his 40s, born in 1974. And he was crowned in 2015, and he's the 51st Oni of Ife. And if you look at his crown, you'll see very obviously that it was actually copied from this crown. And it's got white glass beads. And we know that beadwork, casting in glass, was another skill that the Ife had. And very likely the beadwork that's represented in brass on these sculptures is meant to represent these glass beads.
This hat is bigger.
Yeah, well, it's a little different, right? It's a little higher. So he wants to look more important. 3 tiers, but you're going to see other crowns that have even more tiers than that. Anyway, so I want to talk a little bit about the technique that was used for casting these in brass and copper. This was a technique that was used in many different cultures around the world. And apparently it was not spread by diffusion, but by independent discovery in different parts of the world at different times. So the Ife sculpture is largely dated now between about roughly 1200 and 1500 AD. Okay, so before the European Renaissance, you know, what in the West thinks of as the Middle Ages, like 1200 is like the Gothic age. And very little Gothic art was made with that degree of realism in Europe. But it was not made at the same time as Greek bronzes were made, because Greek bronzes were made, you know, like about, what, 1,000 years earlier than that, okay? So somehow independently, by working in metal, and we know that the Nok had metallurgy because there's evidence that they did ironwork, they developed this technique independently from other parts of the world. The Chinese were casting in bronze back in the Shang Dynasty, 1500 BC, the Greeks later. But there are, bronze objects and copper objects that were cast before the Greeks as well in Europe. So bronze casting was a skill that evolved around the world, and many of them discovered that you can do this lost wax process. So I'm just going to explain how that works. So in my diagram, you see A is a clay core. So first you would fashion out of clay a basic kind of generic form of a head. Then once that dries, you invest that or cover that with beeswax, or I've also heard that the Ife might have used latex. So either it's a material, a kind of natural latex. Natural, because latex is actually a component of rubber, and it's something that comes from a tree. Won't go into the Congo and all that, but there's a whole history of African latex and horrible atrocities that the Europeans did to get latex. But anyhow, so let's just stick with wax. So they cover it with wax, and then the wax is very malleable. It gets soft with contact with the heat of your hands. And you can sculpt it, and then you can refine it with tools. So you can get a very high degree of detail in the wax. Okay, so once you finish your model in wax, which is over the clay core, you would add wax rods, attach wax rods. These are cylinders of wax, and they would create cavities later that would allow the wax, when heated, to melt out, which would leave a thin space, okay? So, and you'd also create a cup of wax that you can cover below the core, which you can cover with what's called an investment, which is a clay casing. Okay, so what you're seeing in D is that whole thing covered in clay, right?
Upside down.
And upside down, yeah. Okay, because the cup is on the bottom. Now we know actually that the Ife casters would put the cup on the top of the head, and they wouldn't turn it upside down. They cast, the metal would go down from the top to the bottom. So there's a slight difference, but this is a generic explanation. So now the whole thing, the clay casing, the wax inside, and the core would be submitted to heat that would melt all the wax out, okay, including the sculpture, right? But now you have a cavity, a negative, a perfect negative of what was sculpted in wax. Plus you have channels, because all those wax rods would have melted out and made channels, which would allow the wax to melt out and also air. So that when you turn it upside down in this case, and you take your crucible, which has the molten metal in it, and you pour it into the cup, it would all be channeled first into the object that you're making, and then the excess would be channeled out, and also hot air would be channeled out. And the trick of this is that you need to keep the metal at a constant temperature so it's molten enough so that it doesn't harden at different rates. It has to all kind of go in there, harden at the same rate, because if it doesn't harden at the same rate, it would crack. So they had to understand this to be able to produce such flawless casts. So there's a lot to it, you know? So once that whole thing cooled down, you would break away the clay casing that is dry and hard, but soft enough to break it away. It would separate and would reveal the bronze or brass or copper duplicate of what you had made initially in wax. And then you would cut away the channels. You would do chasing and finishing so that you wouldn't see a lot of like scars and marks on the brass, and you might also remove the core. So most of the times the core has been taken out. That's the clay material that was inside. So it becomes hollow. Okay, so what we're looking at now are two figures that were also cast in brass, but they were found in two different sites at two different excavations. The one on the left was found in a site in Ile-Ife called Itayemu in 1957. And the one on the right, which is a half figure, was found in Wumonije Compound, along with the other sculptures that we saw in the very beginning in 1938 in the excavation with William Fagg. So it's believed that these both represent an Oni, the king. And you notice again that the crown is similar to the crown that the photograph I showed you earlier of the contemporary Oni of Ife. It's very similar to that. It has a crest. It has one of the full figure has that similar kind of braid with a sort of flame-like finial at the very top. And then the other figure has a star-like shape at the top of the crest. So one of them is damaged. It's only the half figure. And then the other one is the only full figure that has survived. And it's pretty much intact, except it has more patina on it than the other one does. And that might be because the patina was cleaned at some point. So very often patina.
What is that thing like?
What is what thing? The tassels?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's part of probably the royal regalia. In other words, in order to represent him as a king, he has certain objects associated with him. The regalia. So like certain kinds of clothing, the crown is part of the regalia, the objects he holds in his hand, the kilt that the full-length figure is wearing, the ankle bracelets, and the kind of long necklace that's going down like to his knees. All that would be part of the regalia of the king or the Oni. But besides being a half figure who's missing his hand, which is a damage, and the other one being a full figure, there's a few other interesting variations here. So I want to see if you can pick up on them by looking at it. What's a little maybe surprising about the full figure?
Well, it's stunted. It's not properly proportioned.
Okay, it's not realistic proportions, right?
It looks like
Okay.
a baby, yeah.
And they kind of look like midgets.
Like a midget, okay. Okay, it's not meant to represent a midget. We know that the Oni was never a midget, but it is definitely stylized. So here we have these super realistic heads and these bodies that are somewhat naturalistic looking in their individual details, but that proportionately are not realistic. So this was one of the revelations when looking at these figures, that the figures were still stylized to the extent that the head was the most important part. So it was represented larger. So that's symbolic, right? Because the head is the center of intellect. It's the center of thought. It's like a lot of cultures think that the head is where the soul resides. So this is a symbolic form of proportion. It's not meant to be realistic.
Also, the feet are kind of strange.
Well, the feet are the feet. I mean, remember that it has to stand, so they may have made the feet flatter than realistic feet are. But anyway, the proportions are definitely not realistic. It's about 4 heads to a body. In realistic proportions, is usually a standard is about 7 heads to a body. And he's also holding 2 objects. The intact hand of the half figure, you see he's holding the same object, which apparently is a ram's horn. And we know that part of the Oni's regalia was a ram horn that held sort of power substances in it. So what those substances exactly are, I don't know, but they were believed to give power to the authority of the Oni.
When you say power, like, what do you mean?
So say that again?
What do you mean power? Like,
like almost like magical substances that would give power. Because you got to remember that in many cultures, substances were believed to have power. So they would give you power as a ruler, and only you were allowed to own that material. It was like think about a European king, you know, gold or blue,
in a way,
certain colors.
It's like something that's made up. In a way.
Well,
It doesn't actually give them powers. Like,
they believed that it had efficacy.
Well, the scepter of the queen gives.
Yeah, I mean, royal regalia is all about power. It's symbolic, and it may also have some magical power as well. So, like, you know, the orb and scepter in, you know, European royalty, those were symbols of the power of the king, right? So similarly, the Oni would have these power objects that were part of their regalia.
wait, so how come this one, it has a lot of lines on the face?
Ah, okay. So that's a good question. We're going to get to that. Not just on the face, but you see it's on his body too. Okay.
Also,
So
it looks like it doesn't have enough fingers.
No, there's enough.
Yeah, the foot.
no, there's 4 fingers. There's probably there's 5 fingers. I actually see his thumb.
Oh,
But anyway, he has enough fingers. The thing is that there are some Ife sculptures that are smooth and others that have this striation on it, all these marks. And there was a lot of debate about that. What was that all about? Because in contemporary, amongst the Ife now, you don't find people with marks on their faces. But there is a history, even into the 20th century, of regional and ethnic marks that were produced by scarification. And there are men primarily, but also some women who have these ethnic scarifications on their faces. This was done when they were infants and only done on a certain echelon of people. So it showed your power, it showed your ethnic identity, but it also showed your power, that you belong to an elite. So very likely, these represent scarification marks. And there's a lot of evidence for that. So now I'm showing you this figure because this shows you that Ife sculptors were in fact capable of making perfectly proportionate, realistic figures, but they did not do so on purpose. So there we go, knocking the table again, and that makes a lot of noise on Zoom. I'm not going to knock on the table anymore.
It looks like she's in pain a little bit.
Well, okay, so this figure, you know, you have to remember these are about 500, 600 years old. And this particular figure was never buried. This was recovered in the Nupe village of Tada. You can see that in my caption there, which was on the Niger River. Now, that is about 200 miles northeast of Ife. So what was it doing there? We don't know exactly. And actually I have the height here. So it's not a full-scale figure, but it's very realistic in its proportions. If this guy stood up, you would see that he's a fairly, you know, realistically rendered body in relation to his head size.
But their body, their bellies look like women's. I mean, I got that she could.
Men have
Wait,
bellies
that's
too.
a guy?
This is a man, yeah. This is a man. But he's covered, so we don't see his sex organ. But anyhow, so this figure was kept by the Nupe people who lived in this village, and it was revered as a kind of sacred object. So it was washed with water and sand, and that wore the face down. So if you look at the brow ridge, for example, you see that it's very flattened. That's from this repeated washing and, you know, caring for it. And if you look at the chest, you see it looks very smooth. But if you look carefully at the belly, you'll see these striations on the belly, especially in this photograph. In the more colorful photograph of it, you can see that. So probably originally, this figure did have those striations on it, but they've been worn down. And of course, the figure is no longer has its one arm and one hand as missing one foot, but it's believed that it was in a gesture that's found on other Ife art, which is like one hand grabbing another hand, something like this. I don't know if my audience at home is seeing that. But it's conjecture that that probably was the posture of the hands originally. And there were other fragments from this sat on an altar, and there were other fragments from the altar that have survived, but not the entire piece. So it wasn't really fully reconstructed. So this is considered to be one of the masterpieces of Ife sculpture. And the reason it's probably in that remote place is because the Ife controlled a trade route across the Niger River, and they might have put this sculpture there or this altar there to say this is Ife territory or Ife controlled territory. Yeah.
I think she had a question.
Yeah, could it have been, it was all the water, couldn't it have floated down in a storm?
No, it would sink. It's metal. It would sink. Even hollow metal would sink. Yeah. So no, this was kept. And also the Ife didn't live near the Niger River. So how it would have gotten into the river? It would have had to have been brought there. And remember that 200 miles in the remote past was a great distance. You didn't have cars, you didn't have trains, you didn't, I don't know if they had horses, or they may have had horses, but still to travel by horse 200 miles, it's a great distance. So let me go on. Okay, so this is.
That has to be a girl. That has to be a woman.
That's a woman.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, there's a woman. You're relieved now. Yeah, so this is believed to represent a queen. Again, she's wearing an elaborate crown with what probably were glass beads on it. She's very beautiful. These are obviously two views of the same sculpture. She also has these neck rings that you see in a lot of the, you see this on Ife heads, but also in general in Yoruba sculpture. This is believed to be a sign of beauty, these neck rings. So they're like sort of like fat deposits, and they were supposed to be enhance the beauty of the figure. And they're found on both male and female heads from Ife. She, you could see, has a striated face also. And this is another characteristic that I think this particular sculpture really shows very well, that very serene, youthful expression on the face. You never see an aged face in Ife art. There are a few exceptions in small scale sculpture. There's one head, I don't have an image of it, of an old man, a very aged looking face. That's the head of a mace, like a ceremonial mace. It's a weapon. It was probably never used as a weapon because it's too elaborate, but it has a head of an old man on it. And there are also images of captives that have rope gags around their mouths. But those are always small scale. And it seems that when a figure is not a prestige figure, like a very high level person in the hierarchy, the artist was free to make them more realistic. This is true in many cultures, like in Greece. I mean, you think about classical Greek sculpture of the 5th century, everybody's youthful looking, right? They're always sort of captured at the very peak of their beauty, both men and women. But in later Greek sculpture, what's called Hellenistic Greek sculpture, you do see images of children, babies, and old people that you never saw in Greek sculpture before that. So in the case of the Ife, all these heads show a kind of perfect, ideal age, never old or wrinkled or anything like that. So again, these are more heads that were found in this cache in 1938 at Wumonije Compound, all cast in brass or copper. These are, all three of these are male heads. You can see the one on the left has a damage that may have resulted from the excavation. Sometimes they were damaged that way. And there's a dent on one side of his chin. Then the center figure is in really good condition. And then the guy on the right also has some holes in it, because these are quite fragile.
What about the
They're very
hole in the neck?
thin. They're very thin.
The hole in the middle.
The hole in the middle, okay, in the neck, you mean, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, good question. So we're gonna get to that. The holes around the neck, there are usually a few holes around the neck. What would that suggest to you? Like if you're an archaeologist and you found this, and you saw that those holes, and they almost all have holes like that, what would that suggest to you?
That they moved it on like wood or something so they could carry it around.
Okay,
Like
that,
screws.
okay, that they attached it to
Yeah,
something,
yeah,
Yeah.
most likely something of wood, right? A post or
Right,
something
right.
like that. Exactly. So speculation for a long time was that based on a modern tradition amongst the Yoruba was that these heads would have been attached to a wooden body for something called the second burial ceremony. However, that would make sense because you would bury those figures in different places and these were found together. So more likely, archaeologists and anthropologists have noticed that the Benin, which is another group of Yoruba people who are related to the Ife, had a practice of taking bronze or brass heads and attaching them to poles, wooden poles, so that they could be displayed. So now we think that that's probably what happened. The holes were made there so they could be nailed or screwed to a wooden pole. And if they had been attached to the wooden pole, the wood might have rotted out, being underground in a damp climate. So that would be gone, but you would have the brass.
Good question.
Yeah.
How much do these weigh? Do they have like 10 pounds or?
I don't really know the actual weight of them, but they're fairly thin. They're very thin cast, so they're probably not very heavy, but they're. I've never lifted. I mean, wouldn't be allowed to lift one, but they're probably somewhat heavy, but not something that you can't pick up. Not that heavy because they're hollow, and not only are they hollow, but they're so finely cast that they're quite thin. In fact, there are some that are damaged in the casting process that the exterior shell might have gotten too close to the thing and the wax melted out and left a hole. So they're very thin. Yeah. So there are two more of these heads that were found in Wumonije Compound in 1938. One that's striated and one that has a smooth surface. And you see that they're very individuated. In other words, they really look like specific individual people. They don't look generic. The one in the larger photograph on the left has a very round, full face, and the guy in the middle has a much gaunter face and a more prominent nose. So it seems like the artists were intending, and this is somewhat speculative, to represent specific people. And there are cases where Ife have identified, like the Mask of Abalufon II, have identified certain heads that they believe represent specific people. Now, I also included here two views of a piece that was on a European dealer's inventory on his website. You can see that it's heavily patinaed. In other words, the copper that's in the brass oxidizes and turns bluish green like this. Now, usually museums, if they can, will remove a certain amount of patina as long as it's safe to do so. And they'll bring back a sort of a brownish color. But when these were new, they would have been shiny gold. They would not have been brown or blackish or greenish like this. Now, what's curious about this, the head that I have here that's got a patina is that although it conforms a lot to the Ife type, it's a little bit cruder. And that leads me to believe either one of two possibilities. Because Ife art is not allowed legally to be exported, this either was taken out of Nigeria before those laws were enacted, or it could simply be a fake. And there's a lot of fake Ife art in the world. There's a lot of fake African art that's around. I mean, there's stuff that was made for the tourist trade, like this might be that. You know, this I know, you know, was buried to give it the look of being something old. Sorry? No, this is from Yoruba. This is African.
Oh.
But it was made for like probably the tourist trade, because what the artists who make a living imitating traditional art, what they do to make it look old is they deliberately drill wormholes in the wood. These are not wood, these are metal, right? But this has wormholes, and also it has incrustations of soil from being buried, but they would bury it deliberately to give it that look. So, you know, I'm not making any claims for this. This is something that I got online from a bona fide African art dealer, but, you know, the dealer said this is not a highly valuable piece, and that's why I could afford it. If it was like a real ceremonial Yoruba mask, it would have cost much, much, much more than what I paid
How
for
much
this.
would you say?
How much would I estimate it? Thousands and thousands of dollars, so tens of sometimes hundreds of thousands. If it's a very unique and definitely, I mean, if an Ife piece was on the market, I don't know the exact price, but I would tell you hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to buy a real Ife piece. But because the Nigerian government made it illegal in something like, I don't remember, 1957 or 1958, to export Ife art, you can't get Ife art legally on the market. So whatever this piece is, it's either something that came out of Africa before 1958, or it's a fake, or else it's smuggled, in which case it's illegal.
The one at the bottom.
Yeah.
The eyes are making it weird.
Wait, when you say on the, you're talking about the
bottom
piece.
has a hole in the head.
Yeah, that's the same piece.
Yeah,
Okay,
no, I
these
know
two
that,
heads, yeah.
but this side.
Well, I think it's a function of it being a cruder sculpture than I mean, these two are masterpieces. The artist who made these, and maybe it was the same workshop, because that's something we don't know, was a very great sculptor. The sculptor who made that is not on that level. It's like the difference between, let's say, Da Vinci and some very skillful but not as good painter of the Renaissance, you know. It's just something about Da Vinci that's beyond, you know. Anyway, so this is a bona fide Ife terracotta head of a woman. Yes, it's gorgeous. Yeah. And very lifelike. It was excavated in 1958 at another site. Okay.
What's so gorgeous about it?
What's so gorgeous about it?
Yeah.
As a work of art, it's very beautiful. I'm not talking about whether you think the woman in it is gorgeous or not. I'm talking about, you can, you know, in art, you can make a sculpture of an ugly person that as art, it's beautiful, right? So I separate, you know, ideas of beauty from art. There are different kind of subsets of beauty. In art, you can represent something that's horrific, but it could be a beautiful or a great work of art, like Goya, who painted a lot of scenes of witchcraft, and you'd say the people in it are ugly, but it's a great painting or a great drawing or a great, or even you say beautiful, you know, work of art. There's many cases in art where what we think of as beautiful, let's say as an individual person, is very different than the art object itself. So do you understand what I'm saying? Like, if I made a great portrait painting or sculpture of you, I don't know if you think you're handsome or not. I think you're pretty handsome. But anyway, if I made a sculpture of you that's a great sculpture, regardless of how handsome you are, it might be a beautiful sculpture. So that's what I'm really talking about here. And I also think she's beautiful, but that's another story.
Broken down a little bit.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, you got to remember that this was, I'm going to show you a picture. Whoops. Okay, this is actually a photograph taken in 1963 when this very piece was excavated. You see the little picture on top? That's that same head, okay, in fragments. So it was a fragmentary piece that was broken and rediscovered and put back together again. And there was missing terracotta material, so they couldn't really fill in the cracks, okay? So when conservators, you know, people who are trained to restore works of art, put these things back together again, it's partly like reassembling a puzzle, but the ethics of reassembling a work of art is not to put in any additional material. Now, sometimes that's impossible to do. For example, when I worked at the Staten Island Museum, we had a small kylix, which is a Greek wine cup, and it was in 11 pieces. And we had an object conservator reassemble it. She had to make a special mold for it to keep it together. And then there was no way to reassemble it without filling in some of the missing parts. So she did it, but she did it in such a way that anybody could see that's the modern material and this is the original material. So here it's been reassembled with whatever surviving fragments were, and there was no attempt to fill in the missing gaps. So you think it looks ugly because it's broken, but there's the beauty in the broken, right? I mean, like the Japanese.
That's what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
Because it's broken, it's more beautiful.
Well, in a way, yeah, okay. But I think.
Wait, so how come?
Yeah.
Can you go back a little bit?
To what?
To the first, the other one.
I don't want to go too far back because we're going to run out
No,
of
I
time.
just want to show one example.
What is, how far back?
The first sculpture with the woman.
Which one?
Yeah, that one right here. No.
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
No, but those are
So
men.
how come
Those are all guys.
Somebody said, wow, this was beautiful.
No, it's gorgeous.
Oh, I think they're beautiful too.
Yeah,
I don't say
this
they're
is
beautiful
like,
because
wow.
they're men or women. I say they're beautiful because they're beautiful works of art. However, I don't think the two patinaed, the photographs, it's the same piece. I don't think that's so beautiful, not because it's damaged or because it has patina, but because it's not as skillful as those two. Those two, for me, and I speak only for myself, those are beautiful. Those are great works of sculpture. And I even compared them to Da Vinci, right? Who's a great artist, right? One of the greatest artists, yeah?
But you forget, the
Yeah.
difference is these, you feel the life force.
Yes,
And those two.
Yeah.
face,
right.
not a lot.
No, exactly. And that's the sort of the proof of mastery. When you get the life force in them, you feel they're living, they are really, they speak to you, you know? And I feel that about this. Despite
Everybody about this was like, wow.
this, yeah. Well, I go wow every time I see it. I think it's just like a magnificent masterpiece.
Would you just go back
Yeah.
one?
I'm sorry?
Why don't you just run back?
This guy, yeah,
The
these guys.
lady, this one on the side. Is she
Wait,
wearing, like-
no, this is the lady. This is the lady.
No, she was talking about the other one. The other one. This one right
That's
here.
not a lady?
That's not a lady. No, that's a man. That's a man.
Really?
That's a man.
It's a man,
Doesn't
right?
look like
Yeah,
a-
it's believed to represent a man.
Really?
Yeah, yes.
Because I thought it was, you know, some of the parts of Africa.
Yeah.
They put those little things on so their neck is.
Yeah, but those are not,
That's what it
those
looks
are, that's part of the fat tissue of the neck. It's not neck
Really?
rings.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So if that's a man, how come he doesn't have the holes around the mouth?
Some of them don't, not all of them do, yeah. Okay, but let's move on because I'm afraid we're running out of time. Now, I just want to also point out in this little black and white photograph, the image below that shows a traditional Ife pavement, which was made by pounding potsherds, fragments of terracotta into the ground. That's what those diamond shapes are, and then lined with pebbles. So the borders were pebbles. in excavating this or rediscovering this pavement, they discovered that a lot of those potsherds were fragments of terracotta heads, and they were able to collect them and reassemble them to find, to bring back some of those heads. So again, I say, wow, when I see this. This is a woman, a queen, believed to represent the queen. Really magnificent. That's two views of the same sculpture. I hope you realize that, right? And here you can see that back flap that I mentioned in the earlier head of the Oni on the back of the crown. So again, this is somewhat fragmentary. You could see a piece of the neck is missing in one view. You can actually see a necklace that's around on the view of the right side of the head. There's a glass bead necklace that's indicated. And this may have had a body as well, but they haven't been able to reassemble a body for the head. So this was excavated in 1958. And I don't know when these were excavated, but what's really interesting about the figure on the left is that this is the only case where facial hair is represented in relief in the sculpture itself. Okay, so others, we saw those holes. Very likely it was either hair or beading that was added like a fringe over the mouth, because the Oni of Ife was considered a divine king, and you were not allowed to see his face in public. So his face would have been covered with a beaded fringe. And some people thought that that may account for the grooves, the striations on the face, but they follow the contours of the face. They don't look anything like a beaded fringe. And we know from the skill of these realistic heads that if they wanted to, they could have represented a beaded fringe over the face. So no, it's much more likely to be scarifications on the face that they're representing. But the curious thing that those scarification patterns don't really match any traditional Ife facial scarifications. They do match another ethnic group that coexisted, and some of them may have lived in Ife, because there were different ethnic groups that lived in the city of Ife. So there's a theory that it might have actually been another group that had those scars on their faces. But this also, the terracotta mask on the left is a mask. So that's another unique thing about it. So it has two things. One is the facial hair is represented in relief in the terracotta itself. And it has a finished side, not like the whole back of the head represented, open with holes, which look like it might have been used as a mask. And it also has eye holes. You see the one, it's a profile, but it's like this, Again, it has these eye holes. And the other is just a fragment. They haven't found all the pieces. So this is what, has been reconstructed. And it has this very interesting conical cone shape.
So out of these two, which one is more beautiful?
That's up to you.
The last one for me.
I think the fragment is a really beautiful piece of sculpture. And I can imagine that whoever sculpted it was on the same skill level as those other ones that we were calling beautiful. So, but that beauty, like they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. A lot of that is subjective, but there are certain objective things that I can say. For example, if you compare the two ears here, the ear on the mask is much less elegantly sculpted than the ear on the right hand sculpture, which is much more naturalistic and much more elegant and descriptive of a real ear. Realism is not the only criterion to say that a work of art is beautiful or great, but in the aesthetics of the Ife, where they're trying to make realistic sculpture, the realism is important. And that would also be an indicator of the skill of the artist. Now, just talking about who the artists were, we have no idea, but we do think, and this we're pretty sure, when I say we, I mean scholars who've written about this and done research, including Nigerian scholars, that these were made within a time frame of only about 200 years, and that they were probably patronized by the Oni of Ife, who oversaw the workshops and had specific masters who were the sculptors who made sure of like the quality level of the sculpture that was made for royal use. So there were maybe just a few generations of sculptors, maybe even from the same family, because that's often the case in a lot of cultures, where they're like dynasties of artists from the same family or trained in the same workshop, that would have achieved this level of skill to make these sculptures. And then the tradition stopped. So nowadays, of course, since this has touristic interest, you can buy reproductions that look pretty good, but they're reproductions. They're made by mechanical means. They're not made by, they're not made by hand, and it's a totally different thing. So what I'm sharing with you is all stuff that's bona fide, that's in museums that we know, scholars recognize, and we actually know where they were found and things like that. So these are the actual, or pictures of the actual objects. So the piece here on the left is very exceptional because, for one thing, it's in very good condition. It's also terracotta. All the things I'm showing to you now are made of terracotta, which is cooked earth, literally. And you could see that the base of the neck has a certain finish that's very well preserved. And the flesh, which is unstriated, it's a clear face, no lines, is in very good condition. There's very little indication of any erosion to the clay. There's some damage to the nose and the bottom lip, but that's about it. So now the Ife believe that this piece, they say that this piece was never buried, that it was maintained in the palace of the Oni of Ife, and that it represents a specific individual who is identified as the usurper Lajua. And a usurper is someone who steals the power illegally from a king. So he is noted to have seized the throne of Ife after the death of the Oni Owarakolokim. I'm sorry, I'm trying to sound out the reading because I don't know how you read this, properly in Yoruba. But anyway, so he seized the throne, and we know that he was executed for that. He was decapitated. So this is a terracotta representation of that particular individual, according to the Ife, okay? We don't know who the other head represents, but it seems also to be a portrait of a very specific individual. And I juxtapose these two images because they seem to be wearing very similar crowns. So I'm sure that has some significance. And then talking about facial scarifications and markings, this is other evidence of that practice in Ife art. So the two on the left have similar raised wheels. These are like wounds on the face. And one expert in the art of Ife, a guy named Frank Willett, who wrote extensively on Ife art, interviewed the living Oni at that time in the 1950s and 60s. And he told Willett that there were certain ritual periods when very high level people like the Oni and the royal family men would put extract of a blister beetle on their faces, which would raise these wheels to show a kind of strength because it was very painful, and it would make temporary marks on their faces. So that may be what was represented in these two heads. As far as I know, there are only these two heads with that kind of scarification on them. And then this other fragmentary head shows another type of scarification, which is documented, this kind of what's called cat's whisker scarification, and there are photographs of men with this kind of scarification on their faces. So that might have been Nupe, the different ethnic group that did that. So I talked about how the Nigerian government made it illegal to export Ife works of art. And this is an interesting exception. The only other Ife work of art, it's definitely authentic, that exists in an American museum, besides a very small head fragment that for many years was in the Brooklyn Museum, and I'm going to show a picture of that to you as well. This is in the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, and it was acquired in 1994 from an African art dealer who acquired it from a private Swiss collector. So again, I would say the only way that Swiss collector could have gotten this piece was that it was exported before the laws in the 50s were enacted, so he was able to get it.
So he just got it, like he just took it?
No, he didn't take it. Someone took it out of Nigeria. Could have been a smuggler. This guy, or this person, I don't know if it's a man or a woman, but anyway, a collector in Switzerland purchased it from that individual, then wanted to sell it through a dealer, a well-known European dealer in African art, and then that was purchased by the Kimball Museum for their collection. That was apparently a legal and sanctioned sale, because in 1994, this would all be, you know, there's an international network of art dealers and art theft, you know, Interpol and so forth. So it'd be very hard to sell something illicitly in an illegal market, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And it doesn't mean that even museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art buy things from what turn out to be smugglers, because there's recent cases of that. There's a very famous Greek crater that apparently was sold illegally from Italy, that was smuggled out of Italy, and the Met had to give it back to Italy. So, you know, that happens. So nobody said to the Kimball, as far as I know anyway, hey, you have this Ife head, you got to give it back. You know, they display it and they say it's Ife. So anyway, this is the actual photograph that's on their website from the Kimball Museum of that piece. Those are my photographs of it. You know, these images. Yeah, I went to the Kimball Museum and I saw this. So. And I said, Ife head, what's it doing here? How did they get that? It is very beautiful, yeah. So these are some more heads, female heads from Ife, and shows you the variety also of the kind of hairstyles that are represented on these heads. And I want to push on because we're running out of time, but I have to tell you a little personal experience that I just had today. So I gave this talk this morning at a chapter of Greenwich House, and I stopped off at a little falafel joint on my way home called Taim, and there was a young woman working in the kitchen that was preparing the falafel sandwich that I ordered. And she looked exactly like this woman in the, exactly. I said, oh my God. She's like, no, she didn't have the hat on. She didn't have a hole in her head, and she didn't have striations on her skin. She had beautiful skin, but she looked just like that. So it's like looked exactly like this woman. So it's like, wow, I saw the Ife head in life. I didn't talk to her. She was busy, but I was looking at her thinking, wow, that's amazing. She looks just like the lady in the picture I had on my presentation.
Could you just go back one so I can take that one?
Quick, because there are people online looking at this. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. So, and I also want to point out that the head to the right was one of the objects found by Frobenius in 1910. So this is known to Frobenius, then published subsequently, and now it's in the museum in, I think it's in the Ife Museum. There are two museums in Nigeria that have the bulk of this material, the Ife Museum and in a museum in Lagos, which is the capital city of Nigeria, and maybe a few things in some university collections. But you should not really see much Ife art in museums around the world outside of Nigeria because of the exportation laws. So this is the little head, it's 2 views of it, that used to be on display at the Brooklyn Museum. And it was in the Brooklyn Museum's collection as a loan from a private African art collector based in New York City since 1954, which is, by the way, the year I was born. So this used to be, I used to visit I went to school at the Brooklyn Museum. There used to be an art school there. And this was one of the objects I used to visit all the time. So this was sort of like my introduction to Ife art. I saw this and said, oh, that's so beautiful. And it's a fragment. What is that? Where did that come from? You know, that really got me interested in this. And then subsequently, or around the same time, I found a book on Ife art and I bought it.
Right.
So I still have that book.
So
to this
at
day.
that age, to you, what made it like beautiful? You know,
What
because
made
you
it
were
beautiful
young,
to
you
me?
didn't know about it. Yeah.
Well, like you were, some people were saying, it's like a speaking object. It spoke to me. I just saw it and I said, that, I just think that is outstandingly beautiful. And when I look at it, it moves me. So, I mean, I think beauty, and I'm not talking about a pretty person, I'm talking about real beauty, is moving. It moves you. It somehow communicates something to you beyond just like the superficial, like, oh, that's pretty. Like, yeah, flowers are beautiful and I love flowers, but I don't necessarily want to see a bad painting of flowers. I want to see maybe a great painting of flowers. I'll respond to that. Now, you know, if you ask me what's a great painting of flowers, that's a whole long thing. I can't get into that right now.
But did you know that was the only Ife art in the museum?
Yes, yeah. So it was very rare. I didn't know that though. I'm like a kid. I was like, I don't know, the first time I saw this, I was probably about 15 years old. And I was already into art. So I was looking at art. I was going to, you know, the library had a big section of art and I would take out books and look at art all the time. So I was kind of obsessed with art, even at a young age. But when I saw this, I said, wow, this is really special. This is really great.
Yeah, it's different, you know.
It's,
The point is, I think,
yeah,
is that it looks alive. It looks like a real person. Some things look static and dead and just a, you know, a description of something. And some people look like, and some artwork looks like it'll talk to you.
Yeah.
It can move.
right.
And
Right,
it's also
right.
the way you see it, because to me, the other side is my preferred looking at that.
Yeah, and actually, I don't have
Because the lighting on
a
this
purely
one is so
frontal view, but the one photograph, you could see it's mounted. You can actually see the mounts in both photographs. The little bits of metal that come around to fasten it to make it secure. But in the museum, it had this kind of linen fabric behind it. So that's what you're seeing in this photograph. In the other photograph, I found the background distracting, so I removed it for the PowerPoint presentation, just to isolate it. And I also felt the lighting was more even here, so you get a better sense of the surface. But neither of these are purely frontal views.
Yeah, no,
Yeah. So let me just, this is my last slide. And then if there's a few minutes left, there's also some people on Zoom that may have had some questions. So I mentioned that the Benin were another group of Yoruba people. So they have a linguistic link. They both speak dialects of Yoruba, which is a language as well as an ethnic group. And the Benin say that the Oni of Ife sent bronze casters, artisans to the Oba, the king of the Benin people, and introduced this technique to the Benin people. And then they developed their own mastery of these techniques and made their own works of art. So these are some Benin heads. This is a bronze head of a woman with an elaborate conical crown, and the base is original, and it has a fish on it. And I'll explain what the significance of the fish is in a moment. And she's wearing beaded necklaces too, okay? So, and there was an inlay there of another material. I don't know whether it was ivory or some other material, but ivory was very important. So you can see that this is actually on display in a museum because you see in the background another head. So this is in the Volkskunde Museum in Berlin. It's part of their collection. It's not Ife. It's not Ife, okay? It's Benin. Wait, again ahead of time. Okay, so now I've shown you this masquette. That's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's made of ivory, and we know that this represents the Queen Mother Idia, who is the mother of the Oba Ezegie. So this is a historic figure meant to be understood as a portrait of this Queen Mother, who was like the second most powerful person in the Oba kingdom. After the Oba himself, who's the king, it's the Queen Mother, the mother of the Oba, okay? And this is made of ivory. So ivory was a material that was like under the jurisdiction only of the Oba. He controlled the ivory trade. He made sure that ivory, the raw ivory or carved ivory, would only go to people that he would allow it to go to. So what's interesting about this is that it was worn by the Oba as part of his royal regalia. So there his mom, who would be worn on his waist like this. It was not a it's smaller than life size. That's why it's called a masquette. It's a miniature mask, and it would have been worn as part of the royal regalia around the waist of the Oba. And it has a very specific iconography, like a symbolism. So if you look at the top, the crest, it has little fish and little heads, okay? So the fish, which is the fish that's on the base of the other sculpture, I'm going to tell you, hold on. That is a mudfish, which doesn't sound very glamorous, but it's a fish that lives in the water, but during drought, it could survive on the land. So it has sort of like very primordial lungs and gills. And also, like an eel, it gives off a little electric shock. So the mudfish was identified with the power of the Oba. So you see the mudfish in a lot of Benin art. And then the other thing that's on there are little heads. Those are representations of Portuguese merchant seamen. That's the first Europeans that had trade with the Benin people. And one of the major objects of trade was ivory. So the Oba had exclusive control over the ivory trade, and he traded with the Portuguese. He traded raw ivory, in the form of just a tusk, but also eventually finished goods that were made by Benin craftsmen to appeal to European tastes. Things like cups, salt cellars, which were containers for salt, very elaborate ones that had images of European rulers on it, carved in a Benin style, but based on European engravings that Portuguese sailors had with them and showed them to these Benin ivory carvers. But this was not made for European export. This was specifically made as part of the royal regalia of the Oba. Okay, and then one more image. This is a bronze head that originally would have had a carved ivory tusk coming out of the top of the head, and it represents probably a queen. And this is the current Oba of Benin, El Ewurare, this, I'm sorry, I'm
What
pronouncing
is
it
the
badly.
Oba?
The second. Sorry?
The Oba, what is that?
The king. It's the king of the Benin. Now, he has no real true political power because there's a government of Nigeria.
The voodoo masters in a way?
Forget voodoo masters. This has nothing to do with voodoo masters. He's a descendant of the Oba lineage, right? But they don't always have like the oldest son become the Oba for whatever reason. And this guy, I believe he studied in London. He went to school in London. And he's a very educated man, but he was crowned the Oba of the Benin people. But he only has influence as a kind of figurehead, a lot like the Queen. She could dissolve parliament, but she was a figurehead. She had no real political power. So similar to that, the Oni of Ife, there's an Oni, which you saw. I showed you a photograph of him. And there's this Oba of Benin. And the regalia that he's wearing here was for some ceremonial event, and very similar to the kinds of beaded coral regalia that you see in. So this crown, the crown and the bronze figures, they would have been made the real crowns would be like that, made of beads made of coral, because coral and ivory were like royal prerogative materials. So I do want to take a moment to look if anybody, I see 5 chats. Total number of excavated pieces. I don't know what the total, but it's well over 100 at this point. On view currently in Met Museum show African Origin of Civilization. I have not seen that exhibition, but there might be some material, from Ife that is in the exhibition, which I have not seen. Let's see what else. You answered my second question. Okay. The Benin sculptures were recently returned. What is the status of the heads you were discussing? Where did the glass beads come from? Okay, so someone asked where the glass beads came from. The glass beads in Ife art were made by the Ife. They had glass making skills. The beads on the Benin, on the other hand, were probably coral and not glass. Some glass beads were imported from Europe, but in the case of the Ife, they made their own glass. They did not import them.
Somebody just asked a question.
Okay. Okay, let me just address these though. Okay, some Benin sculptures have been returned by museums because many of these Benin bronzes were looted from the Palace of Benin in 1897 by the British during a punitive raid. They destroyed the palace, they looted the bronzes, and they brought them to Europe, and then they sold some of them off to pay for the cost of that punitive raid. And that came about because some British troops went invaded the Benin city during a sacred ritual, and foreigners were not allowed to enter. And the guards, the militia that was there, without the Oba knowing, killed some of those soldiers. So in retribution, the British troops in Nigeria at that time were sent in, and they sacked and looted and burnt down the palace, stole the Benin bronzes, brought them to Europe, sold off some of them, but a lot of them are still in the British Museum in London. Some of them were sold to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And some of them have been repatriated to Nigeria, but a lot have not. I don't know if what?
You mean Benin?
Right, Benin objects. I'm not talking about Ife objects. I'm talking about Benin objects. No, these objects. Let's see. The Benin sculptures were recently returned. Some Benin sculptures were recently returned. What is the status of the heads you were discussing? I don't think the museum in Berlin is returning that head, at least at this point. I'm not sure what museum the other head is from, but not everything came from that Ray Bellotte did. And I think that museums now, there's a spotlight on this, so there's more pressure to return things, but that doesn't mean they get returned.
Right.
So, okay, and let me just see. Yeah, the ivory masquette is on view at the Met. That's correct. The masquette reminds me of Japanese netsuke. Well, that's circumstantial because Japanese netsuke, which are these miniature sculptures, often are made from ivory, which is either imported from India or from Africa. The Germans did horrible things in Nigeria, covered a few months ago in a documentary on Al Jazeera. Europeans in general did horrible things in Africa. The Belgians in the Congo did horrible things. I mean, yeah, the French, I mean, they're all guilty of doing atrocities in Africa. And some of this is a result, not the Ife stuff, but the Benin stuff was definitely, stolen and brought to Europe and then sold off to different museums. So
I heard Congo was the worst.
Congo was really horrible, yeah, because they had rubber plantations, and if African laborers didn't meet their quotas, their fingers, their hands, their feet were chopped off. It was very barbaric. The savages were the Europeans in Africa, not the Africans. Well, not just the Belgians. I mean, all the Europeans did some really terrible things, but that's absolutely true. And we've kind of run out of time, but thank you, those of you who actually came here, and thank you, those of you on Zoom who shared this with me. And, we're doing another talk next month in November called Faces from the African Diaspora, which is about artwork that focuses on people of African descent who came to different parts of the world and were painted or sculpted by various artists of the West and also the Americas, North America, South America, and Africa. So join me again for that. And thank you very much.
Yes.
Will do.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
I love these.